Welcome, everybody, to our fourth episode of Heresy at the Haven. Coming to you from the Gamers Haven in Spokane, Washington. This is a Wobbly Goblin Adventures podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Bob.
I'm Jay.
I'm Steven.
This first series of episodes we're trying to focus on kind of one collective series for a new player interested in getting into Age of Darkness, the Horus Heresy tabletop game. List building, army building, helping you select what kind of army you may want to play, whether it's based on their lore, artwork, their style, whether
Their color.
their color could be. Somebody likes yellow.
Does their names sound cool?
Right. So, right. There's a lot of things that go into it. We've talked about in past episodes, other things to keep in mind. Tonight, what we're going to talk about is actual list building, and we're going to break down some of the components involved with list building. First of all, I'm going to go over the books real fast. Top right here, this is your main Horus Heresy rulebook, Age of Darkness rulebook. It looks intimidating. Only about 20% of it is actually rules. The majority of the book is a lot of lore. The missions are in here. There's campaign play in here. There's all sorts of fun things inside of this. Then underneath this, we have the two books, the Traitor book named Heretics and the Loyalist book. Almost identical in the first half. We're going to dip more into these later when we get into looking at these factions. Then you have some of the other faction books. We have Mechanicum, we have Imperium. We'll dig into those more later. And then we have our first campaign book that's come out, the Siege of Cathonia. So to play the game, really all you need is the main rule book, and then whichever legion you pick, that book, whether it's this one, or this.
You don't feel like you have to buy everything.
Yeah, you don't have to have them all. You don't have to be like us and own everything.
Or you can.
Digital and paperback. So I'm going to start off. I'm going to talk about the actual focus of building an army and the chart you have to use. It's called a force organization chart. It's kind of like an outline. If you think of, let's compare it to maybe like a chessboard where you have one king, one queen, you have two bishops, two rooks, all your pawns. It's kind of what a force organization chart looks like. When looking at the chart, you'll see that there are 8 categories. The big ones are your HQ choices, your troop choices, your elite choices, your fast attack choices, and your heavy support choices. You'll notice when you look at it, there's one of the HQ choices in black and 2 of the troop choices in black. Those are your compulsory choices. Those are the ones that you have to take to play the game. So you have to have 1 HQ choice. You have to have 2 troop choices. Afterwards, you'll see the shadowed boxes behind, or actually the non-shadowed boxes behind. You can take up to 2 more HQ choices. You can take up to 4 more troop choices. You can take up to 4 elite choices, 3 fast attack, and 3 heavy. Now, when building your army, you don't have to take anything but those 3 compulsory. The rest are optional. You don't have to have elite choices. You don't have to have fast attack.
But you should.
But you may want to, absolutely.
Mix and match. Have some fun.
And just kind of a quick overview, your HQ choices, these are your leaders, the ones who are running your army, right? Your troop choices, think of them as your pawns. They're going to be your basic infantry. There's a handful of different ones. Some of them are focused on sitting still and sitting on objectives. Some are moving forward and punch people in the face. But they're your basic infantry, your basic troops. Your elite choices, these are going to be your veterans. They're going to be more equipment options, more special rules attached to them. They're going to be more durable. They're going to be tougher. And the points are going to be higher on your elite choices than they are going to be in your regular troop choices. Fast attack choices, they're going to be, generally speaking, they have more movement on the tabletop, whether they're bike squads, jump pack squads, different squads that have abilities to move across the table faster, whether it's for outflanking, trying to get to other objectives, which we'll get to in a minute here. They're just their whole role on the tabletop is to move across the table faster.
Usually more of a glass cannon.
Can be. Yeah, most definitely
And
can be.
some of these sound a lot more important than others, but like when you're going over the troops, they might not sound exciting. We'll go into why they're incredibly important when it comes to gameplay.
Absolutely. And then your heavy support. They are your, generally speaking, sit back, lay down fire support. This is where you're going to find a lot of your big heavy tanks.
Big guns.
Big guns, that's right. And some forces excel in lots of big guns. Some forces excel in your fast attack. Some forces excel in elite choices. And that we'll get to that later on when we're talking about some of the actual, when we get into breaking down the different legions and some of the other factions. That's your basic force organization chart. I would say the average points played for Horus Heresy is around 3,000 points, different from a lot of the other Warhammer-based games.
So if you're unfamiliar, that is your point limit.
Correct.
You're agreed upon with your opponent. We're going to play 3,000 points today. You can't go over that 3,000 points.
Yeah, and the whole purpose of the chart is I'm not going to fill my 3,000 points up with all HQ choices or all elite choices. We'll get to some rights of war later, which are one of the things used in structuring a force where maybe you can bring some more of those options, but you pay the price for it.
Well, I mean, and to tag on to your earlier point about chess, you're not going to bring 3,000 points worth of pawns. Or maybe you are.
Maybe you are.
It all depends on what you're going for.
Right.
Definitely skews towards balance, but there's definitely ways you can kind of build certain degrees every direction.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So that's the quick overview of the force organization chart. Let's move on to line and denial units.
Yeah, so now we've kind of established that you're picking certain fast attack choices, heavy support choices. As you're building your list, the next thing you kind of want to think about is something called objectives. Now, maybe half, if not more, missions in Horus Heresy are called objective-based games. It's not just, I shoot you, you shoot me, who's left surviving.
Otherwise, we'd all just build gun lines and
Exactly.
sit back and shoot each other, right?
A lot more dynamic games I find is when you're fighting over pieces of territory and things like that. So you need troops that have a subtype, we'll get to that a little bit later, called line. That means they're actually allowed to stand there, claim an objective, and score you points.
And they're the only ones that can claim objectives. And really, a quick recap on that. What we're talking about is at the end of the game, to determine who has won and lost the game, you score victory points for different things, whether it's destroying units or holding objectives. Whoever has the most victory points has won the game, and only line units.
Just think of the objective as king of the hill. I own this territory, you're trying to take it away.
Right.
I try to keep you off it. That kind of goes into everything besides line, well, and including line is also called a denial unit, except for vehicles. Although, again, some rights of war special rules will allow your vehicle to score. For the most part, they don't. And denial units, again, if they're kind of contesting an objective, is how you keep your opponent from scoring that objective.
Right. So if I have a line unit sitting on an objective, and you're able to move a squad up, it's generally speaking, an objective is a 40 millimeter round. Some people use bases, some people use different. You can use really fun, creative, built, modified objectives, but you have to be within 3 inches of that objective. So if you have a line unit within 3 inches and you're scoring it, if your opponent moves within 3 inches of that, you're no longer scoring that objective.
Yeah, it's really dynamic gameplay.
And objectives can also be buildings and different aspects of terrain, and depending on what you're doing. Feeding off of. So you have line, you have denial, you have objectives. The next thing that we're going to talk about are characters. The characters are usually part of an HQ choice. They focus mainly in 2 categories, a praetor and a centurion. Praetors are your elite of the elite, I guess you could say. They are the most veteran leaders that you have.
Could be a company master, could be a chapter master.
Absolutely, any of those things. And centurions, they're kind of like the next level down. They have a lot of experience in things, but usually they specialize. So centurions can be upgraded to something called consuls. And consuls are specialized, lots of fun, very different leaders, such as librarians, for example. You can upgrade a centurion to a librarian where they can use psychic powers, which is essentially the magic of 40K universe. If you were trying to understand it, it's magic from the warp, the chaos, the things like that. It's all chaos.
All comes back.
But there's also different ones if you're playing smaller games than 3,000 points. So if you're playing a game, for instance, that's 1,000 points or less, you're not allowed to take a praetor, and you need to take a centurion called a delegatus, which gives you the classification of warlord. Warlord is specifically a title given to Master of the Legion.
You have to have a warlord.
You have to have a Master of the Legion, which would be your warlord. Yes.
I think it's important. We might have missed it before. We're doing this through the lens of Space Marines.
Correct.
Mechanicum don't have praetors and centurions.
Correct.
Lusha don't.
Yeah, right now.
Sorry if we missed that.
Yeah, good point.
Simplifying it, we're doing through this kind of lens of Space Marines.
Right.
Everyone.
Something else about the characters is they can be independent of all of your other units, but they can also join other infantry units. They can't really join vehicle units because
Special cases, of course.
there are exceptions, as you've probably figured out by now. There's an exception to all the rules because that's the way it's done. Generally, your centurion or your praetors are going to join different types of units for different purposes.
It's important to point out, too, that if a character joins a unit, they can't be targeted now if they're part of that unit. If you had your character out on his own, they can catch a heavy weapon to the face and get killed in one shot.
Which that's incredibly important, but also there's ways to snipe them out of a unit.
That's true.
So they're, like we said, exception to every rule. That's essentially your Praetors versus Centurions. There's 3 options for Praetors, and it's essentially different types of armor.
Mm-hmm.
And for Centurions, not only do you have different types of armor, but you also have vastly different specialized purposes for them.
Oh, yeah.
So much war gear.
Chaplain.
And on top of, yes, chaplains are great. On top of there being the generic console upgrades for the Centurions, generally, I think each legion has their own specific. Most legions have their own specific console upgrade for a Centurion.
I also wanted to add, characters, they're usually always more powerful.
Oh, yeah.
Super important.
Tanks in close combat.
Especially when it comes to leadership. Again, it's kind of think of them as a sergeants, the leaders of your army, HQ choice after all. Keeping them alive is always going to be key.
Yeah. And a lot of those console upgrades, they give a bonus to a unit that they've joined or a unit that's close to them. Quick example, I'd mentioned chaplains. I love using chaplains in my world eaters because they give a close combat unit a bonus when they charge into combat or they get charged, or Master of Signals can affect your reserves, which we'll get to. Most of the console upgrades are giving your army you can build your army around using your consoles to help your army function better the way you want it to function. We touched on the fact that you have to have a warlord in your army. The main reason behind that is almost every mission you'll get bonuses for actually killing your opponent's warlord. The warlord will generally have more, they're going to be better in close combat. They're going to be tanks. You can build them to be just monsters in close combat. But a warlord can take a warlord trait. And a warlord trait is something that, again, may affect just them and the unit they've joined. It's kind of an extra buff to them and the unit, or some may even affect units around them. Some may affect the whole army. And generally speaking, if it's something that affects the whole army, if that warlord is killed, that effect will go away. But it's just a warlord trait, and your warlord and how you build your warlord is another aspect of getting your army more customized to the way you want it to play and the way you want to build it. So building a warlord is pretty important. It really is. And it really can kind of give you the background and story of how your army is. And it could be based off of a story you've read. Now, one of the fun things about the books is, again, we'll touch on it more later, but each individual faction, for example, my world eaters, I have Karn. He's called Karn the Bloody, and now he becomes Karn the Betrayer later. I love playing Karn. He's my thing. I've never been kind of secret about that.
Always Karn.
Always Karn.
But there are characters throughout the stories that don't have models made for them or even rules made for them. So you can take your basic Praetor and maybe build him, and this is also one of my parts of the passion of the hobby, is convert him from different bits and pieces and put them together and make him, like from my story arc, maybe I want to make Bloodspitter, or I want to make one of the other characters from the World Eaters that they've never actually made rules for. And now I'm just going to call my Praetor by that name, and I've built him to look like him.
And something that should be noted is there are generic warlord traits.
Mm-hmm. Oh, good point. Yeah.
But there are also legion-specific warlord traits.
Right. And
even then, there are some legions that have special characters that are listed in the books, and they each also have their own specific warlord trait that if you take them as your main guy, that's the warlord trait that you get. So it kind of shapes, like you said, it shapes how you build the army and how it plays on the tabletop. So
you can really drive that for sure.
Yeah, they are the leader of the army.
All right, so we've talked about kind of the basic choices you get when you're building your army list. But as we know, 30K, is also about the big stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Who doesn't like a Titan or a super heavy tank?
Right. Bring that fell blade out. Bring out those big
That's
boys.
one of the reasons that 3,000 points is generally the rule of thumb for size of force.
Right. So you get an option of also the demigod, of course, of every legion is a Primarch.
Mm-hmm.
And these Primarchs and these super heavy tanks and Titans out there, they cost a lot of points. And they're usually pretty powerful.
Right.
So to kind of balance that, your point limit will kind of limit how many points you can spend on those choices.
Right.
And that comes down to 25% of your limit. You can't go over that when choosing a Primarch or a super heavy. Something to keep in mind, because we all want to play all the super heavies. You can't, unfortunately, but those options are there.
Sure.
So for 3,000 points,
You have 750 points.
You have 750 points
right.
of that 3,000. It's not in addition to. It is included in your 3,000 points that you can spend on super heavies and Primarchs.
Right.
And that may sound like a lot, but a Warhound Titan is 750 points.
Yeah, most Primarchs are in that 450 to 600 range points wise. Should be noted too, again, in list building, Primarchs, but these are the gene seed father. They're the one that the whole Legion was based off of. And there's a wonderful backstory about the Primarchs were all lost, and the crusade was about going and finding all these Primarchs and bringing them back and reuniting them with their legions. But putting a Primarch in your army is devastating. And if you end up against an opponent and they have a Primarch and you don't, it's going to be a rough game. So it's one of those things where, if you're going to competitive play at a tournament or something, there'll usually be rules built in saying whether you can take a Primarch or not. And if you're playing a fun pickup game, if you're bringing a Primarch, make sure your opponent knows you're bringing a Primarch. Yeah, mention it beforehand. Or maybe even if it's just you're heading down to your local friendly game store for a pickup game, maybe have two lists ready to go, one with your Primarch, one without. That way, if you pick up a game with somebody who doesn't have a Primarch, you're like, well, I'll play this list instead. Because, man, somebody's running Lionel Johnson around in my backfield. It hurts. Unless I can throw Angron at them.
It may seem like it's just a catchphrase, but they really are game-changing units.
Yeah, they really
demigods.
Yeah, right. Absolutely.
So,
allies.
I love allies.
I know you love.
Because you play Alpha Legion, I believe,
Do
correct?
any of us really play Alpha Legion?
Would they really be allies, or are they just more Alpha Legion?
Exactly. So allies, when you're doing a primary detachment, I'm an Alpha Legion player. I think I've mentioned this. So if I'm playing an Alpha Legion as my primary detachment, you can take what's called an allied detachment, which means you use one of the other legions, one of the other options that there's another chart that we haven't discussed, but there's an allied matrix chart. So it talks about how who I do have it over here. Yes. It talks about who can ally with who and based on how strong that alliance would be. It also says who can't ally with who. I think the only red one on here, right, for the ones that we play is World Leaders.
This is actually coming from the storyline.
This is coming from storyline-based things.
There's no reason the Ultramarines would be allying with World Leaders.
Correct.
They hate each other. Right?
So one of my first tournament I played in was I based it on a specific battle, like series of battles, and it was essentially Alpha Legion using a Dark Angels allied detachment. So essentially, I use the force org chart that we talked about, and I build my main primary force, and then there's a smaller allied detachment force organization that you're going to use based on that particular aspect. So
it's just a smaller chart compared to the main force. Same idea, one HQ, in this case, one troop, and you have a few fast attack heavies.
Correct. Smaller. Then you get one of each of the other fancy choices, and you get a couple troop choices, but you have to take one HQ and one troop choice for your allied detachment. Now, there are things in the game that make allied detachments lots of fun, and there are things in the game that make allied detachments really annoying for your opponents. As we said before, there's things called objectives. You also get points for killing your enemy units, and particularly with Alpha Legion, I can make all of my allied detachment not count for victory points.
It's pretty brutal.
I think the key with allies is you still have your point limit, 3,000 points per
stay within. Yep.
And you're just combining two armies.
Right.
Now, a couple of schools of thought is the narrative version of that, where you're playing a certain battle. In your case, was Alpha Legion and Dark Angels.
Correct.
But you also, if you're going into events and everybody's kind of going there for the same reason, you can actually really shore up some weaknesses of your main legion if you're kind of going that route in list building.
So if I was playing World Leaders that are all close combat, maybe I ally in some Iron Warriors that are really good at firepower. So they're going to sit back and lay down some heavy firepower while my World Leaders are marching forward.
Just food for thought.
Yeah.
And I would say for a newer player, I wouldn't really dip into allies maybe right away, but it is a fun list building aspect, whether you want to do it for more the narrative side. Maybe I bring in, If you know your fluff, Argyltall and some Galverback from the Word Bearers to hang out with Karn. They're all the besties that hang out together. Or I'm going to go more competitive and bring in the Iron Warriors to help for the fire support. But allies are a fun way to add to your army list, but certainly not mandatory, and maybe not the best way to start out of the game.
No, and definitely, and as you've probably realized, we really like to dip into different types of lore and things, even though these are for beginners jumping in. We hope that everybody can find use for it. So if you don't understand some of the things that we're talking about or the characters that we're introducing and doing examples of, don't worry. If you stick with it like we did, you will eventually understand.
Join us on this journey.
Yes.
The next part I want to talk about is reactions. Now, reactions, they're actually kind of a mechanic of the game, and there's a reason we're adding it into the list building conversation is when we start dipping into Legion-specific rules and some of the other faction-specific rules, reactions are going to come up a lot. What reactions are is actually a mechanic in the game. You get one reaction with exceptions per phase, so movement phase, shooting phase, assault phase, and it's a way for you to respond to something your enemy's doing. So in the movement phase, maybe they move within 12 inches of you, you could move away or you could move closer to them. Or in the shooting phase, you shoot at a unit, you can have one unit fire back at that unit that shot at you. Just wanted to throw that in there as far as list building goes is, as you'll see later, with reactions in mind, it could actually affect how you want to build your army, right?
Absolutely.
We'll get into some in a minute here. We're going to get into some of the other aspects of deploying your army, whether you're just starting on the table or bringing them in a different means. And there's a reaction called intercept where you can shoot at somebody if they come in on the board from reserves. And there's war gear that allow you to do that a whole lot. It's a pretty contentious thing in the whole overall community. But that's maybe something you want to build into your list is taking these things called augury scanners, which we'll talk about later, because you don't want a whole army outflanking you without being able to respond to it.
No reprisal.
So, right. So it's reactions are something you do want to think about. We're going to mention reactions a lot when we start going into a lot of Legion focus. So I just wanted you to be aware that these reactions are a way that while you're playing the game, you get to interact in your opponent's turn. And I think it's important to, when you start getting into the depth of list building, it's important to keep reactions in mind.
It's more like an actual battlefield where you get to respond to
Right.
the enemy's attacks
Right.
and things like that.
Yeah.
So it's not just a stagnant, I'm going to sit here and you get to do whatever you want to me,
Right.
and then hopefully I can weather that.
We want
Right.
that dynamic gameplay for sure.
Absolutely. That's it on reactions.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Okay, so we've kind of covered the basics of list building. You pick your HQ, your 2 troops, and then pick your flavor of units you want from there. But actually, the game gets a lot more deep than that with something called Rights of War. Rights of War, both generic and there's army-specific ones for every legion out there, actually allows and modifies your list building.
They can. Yep.
The units that you can take that might perform certain roles.
Mm-hmm.
So what this does is kind of this narrative-driven list building that's kind of built into the game. So how it works is you have to pick an HQ choice that has a subtype called Master of the Legion. Right. I believe you can only ever have 1 per 1,000 points.
Correct.
In your army list. And what it means is if you have a Master of the Legion, you get to pick a Right of War.
You don't have to.
You don't have to. It is an option.
Right.
Just to give a quick example, a Right of War generic called Pride of the Legion.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about Terminators.
Which are an elite choice. Some of the most elite, most durable troops there are, infantry there are.
To keep it simple, the Right of War allows you to take Terminators as troops.
Right.
You give a couple of them line.
Yep.
You just get an army of elite Terminators that you use to just build your list how you see fit. It's kind of the simplified how Right of Wars work.
Right. There's negatives, always limitations to Rights of War.
I was
as
going to
well.
say, unlike warlord traits that provide a legion-wide or specific boon with no detriment, Rights of War usually have restrictions that go along with the benefits.
Sure. It really does help you kind of build a narrative list. They kind of give you an outline saying, if this is the type of force you're trying to build, you get these bonuses. But if you're having these bonuses, you're trying to build this force, maybe you're not going to have as many of these types of units, or you can't do these type of actions because you've taken this Right of War. So it's usually kind
a
of
good example for that is my main narrative list is called an Armored Spearhead. Again, very simplified. Everything starts the game in tanks. All my infantry is mechanized.
Right.
I actually can't start infantry on the board.
Right. I have my right of war I like to use in my world eaters. Doesn't change any. Well, I guess it does change. Some of my elite choices become troop choices, can become troop choices, but it actually gives me a bonus to how far I move across the table, which helps me a ton because I'm a close combat army. I want to get across the table faster. But my negatives are I can't take any of the allies we talked about, and I can't, and I have to charge. If a unit's available for me to charge, I have to charge it. And I can't multi-charge, which is a more complex thing. But there's some negatives that actually affect my gameplay quite a bit because I'm these crazy, insane berserkers. I'm going to charge whatever's in front of me, and I'm running across table fast. So it helps me, but it also hurts me.
And I prefer not taking a rite of war because
You're Alpha League.
I'm Alpha League. I have too many options already to put limits or limiting things into play, in my opinion. And I mean, I know there's multiple Alpha Legion players here and they play differently than I do, and that's completely fine. I just have taken the route of no rite of wars.
And again, this is where you really want to dive into the books, and I'm sure we'll do deep dives later
We'll talk about rights of war a lot
on
later.
Rights of War. But if you're just getting started, again, the book is your go-to.
Yeah, these are just, again, to kind of recap, we're talking about different things you have to consider while building your list. These are the things you're going to want to think about.
I mean,
Right to war, I think, are a really big function because it'll really choose you. It'll help you decide your purchases, kind of, and make your army more. I like to use the word fluffy, more narrative driven, specifically for the type of force you're trying to build.
And like we said, you don't have to buy everything, but the first purchases.
Well, if you're shopping at the Gamer Saving, you do have to buy everything.
Yes.
I'm sorry, right?
Yeah,
It's on the wall. I think it's
I'm pretty sure that's like has a policy. The books, the rule book, and then whatever legion you were thinking about, those would probably be the best first purchases. So you can start reading to maybe design your list, an idea of what you want to do before you go and start buying a bunch of stuff.
Right.
But there is one thing that we haven't talked about that is also very important for list building, and that's something called reserves. I believe you mentioned it earlier on, and we haven't gotten to it yet, so I just want to make sure we touch on that before we let you go. So reserves...
Maybe talk about how you normally start.
Yeah, normally you roll off, you see who deploys first, and you deploy onto your side of the table in your deployment zone that is a preset zone. And then your opponent will deploy into their preset deployment zone. There are options that allow you to deploy into multiple different kinds of deployments. So
you announce to your opponent ahead of time, I'm going to leave this unit in reserve. That just basically means it's going to arrive later in the game. It's not going to arrive right now.
Correct. Now, there are different types of reserves. We'll go high level. We'll just go over a couple of them. So you can have your reserves walk on to the field.
That's generic reserves.
Generic reserves.
Walk right on the table.
Walk onto the table
from your deployment zone edge. They just walk on the table.
Later on in the game.
Right. Most of the time it starts turn 2.
Turn 2
starts turn 2. That doesn't mean it's coming in turn 2.
Right.
And we'll get into that a little bit more. There's a chance that your guys don't arrive. It gets better and better as the game goes on that they do arrive, but there's a chance. Another one is called Deep Strike Assault, which I believe you mentioned as well. And that's essentially things either coming in from transport ships that are launching these drop pods into the battlefield to teleporting on, things like that. Things are coming out of the woodworks. Speaking of coming out of the woodworks, there's one that salamanders, I think, are really good at. The subterranean assault.
Mm-hmm.
There are these basic huge drills that come up out of the ground and then spill out a bunch of troops and things into the battlefield and causing a bunch of chaos. There's another one called flanking, outflank, where they come in from a different side of the board edge, and you have to determine that.
The gods love outflank.
Yeah, apparently the lights just
came on.
just coming on.
Yeah,
it's one other option. I mean,
it's terrifying, and this goes back into the list building. Like if you have your force deployed, but you know that your opponent's going to drop 20, 30, 40 infantry behind you. That's how Deep Strike Assault and Subterranean Assault works. That you can put it pretty much anywhere on the table with risk, where flanking assault will be them moving onto the table from the board edges. So you got to kind of stay away from the board edge. So you're while you're building your army list, you want to be able to kind of conceptualize how am I going to deal with my opponent has deep strike assault? What am I going to do if they have flanking assault?
Oh,
There's different
absolutely.
ways coming on. So yeah, reserves pretty important.
They're very important.
How to consider when you're building your army list. What I've noticed, I did a little bit of deep strike assault I was only running 1 unit or 2 units of deep strike assault, and my opponent was usually able to handle them real well. So then I was like, well, if I'm going to do it, I need to have more so I can kind of take this whole flank with the deep strike assault, or not do it at all and just move across the table.
The options are endless.
Mhm.
It's so much fun. When you're building your list, you have options never ending of how you want to play the game. It's all there for you.
Right. Yep.
And if you don't like how it plays, you don't ever necessarily have to buy new units, but you can change the way they're deployed.
Sure.
And
So it's actually important to talk about reserves. If you have something that has deep strike assault, doesn't mean you have to use deep strike assault. You can still choose to deploy them on the table and move them across the table.
Be tactical.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Anything else on reserves?
I think that's it. I think those are the main points of list building.
Yeah. Okay.
Things to keep in mind as you build your list.
We've talked about the force org charts. We've talked about the different roles units have on the table. Talked about objectives and line units, characters and warlords, your Primarchs and your super heavies, which are a blast to play, but make sure your opponent's aware. How we can bring allies in, how reactions work, which will come up more later. And then the different rights of war, which will also come up later. We're going to focus on some rights of war when we talk about the different legions. And then reserves, which I think are all very important for list building.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think you just get your army book, get the rule book. You can dive in before you even play a game.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Start getting into it.
All right. Well, let's wrap it up, guys. Remember, if you like our content, you want to see more of us doing what we're doing, you can follow and subscribe. If you want to support us and help grow and create better content, make sure that you check out our Patreon in the link tree posted below. Next episode, we finally do it. We're going to start diving into legions. Right?
And we're not going deep.
Not deep. We're going to do a summary on legions. This whole series, again, we're doing is trying to, at the end of it, we'll wrap up this series. We're going to kind of release it all at once, so you don't have to get trailed out. But it's all about the different things you want to think about while you're thinking about getting into Horus Heresy and what to think about when you're building lists and how to pick the faction. So yeah, I think that's about it.
I'm excited.
I'm excited
Awesome.
too.
Come back.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in.
Have a good one.